Hi class, this is a total review of everything you are going to need to know about primary production. We will go over some key definitions. The very first one you need to remember is that when we say primary production, we are talking about how plants and other organisms can change energy into food for other animals and organisms in our ecosystems. This is a food pyramid. Notice how it is a triangle shape and that each section within the triangle is a bit smaller than the one below it. The bottom section is where the primary producers are located. They have the most energy there for a couple reasons. The primary producers make enough food, or carbohydrates more specifically, that are supposed to sustain all of the organisms in the places that they live and even themselves. Above the primary producers are the primary consumers. To consume means to eat. The primary consumers are the first organisms to eat the primary producers and use the energy they stored inside of them. The primary consumers must eat a large number for the primary producers to survive, which is why the level of the pyramid is smaller than the first. The secondary consumers are the organisms that eat the primary consumers and use the energy stored within them. That group is again smaller than the level before. This is repeated with the tertiary consumers and so on. Some very smart scientists have calculated exactly how much energy is lost between each level, because clearly the levels decrease in size. They found that only 10% of the energy is passed on in between each level, meaning that a whopping 90% is lost. To better visualize this is a simple representation of what happens. So imagine that at the beginning of a chain, the primary producers made 100% of some energy. Only 10% would be able to be used by the next level who eats them. And because they only have 10%, when they are eaten, the next guys will only get 1%, and then 0.1%. You see why succeeding levels are forced to decrease in size. But how do primary producers make the energy? It all starts with the sun. The sun provides a continual source of energy during the day that begins the process. Before we get too crazy, we need to define autotrophs. Autotrophs are organisms that have the ability to change the sunlight into energy that can be used and stored. We usually think of plants that have stems and leaves, but there are also other kinds of organisms, like bacteria or small animals that have chlorophyll, which is the pigment associated with capturing light in order to change it. To recap, the sun provides energy in the form of sunlight. The autotrophs then change it into usable energy called carbohydrates, and then other organisms eat the primary producers so they can use the carbohydrates that were made. To get more technical, this is the chemical equation for photosynthesis that you may have seen before. Photosynthesis is the process by which some energy from the sun is changed. There's a law that says matter and energy on Earth and space cannot be made out of nothing, it can only be changed. We're going to explain how this principle applies. In this equation, we can see that carbon dioxide, when combined with H2O, water, can be changed into carbohydrates, C6H12O6, and O2, oxygen, which we also use to breathe. This is where that comes from as well. Here's a picture of photosynthesis. An autotroph takes in sunlight from the sun, carbon dioxide from the air, and water from the ground. And after photosynthesis, oxygen will be released and the carbohydrates, or sugars, will be stored. This is a close-up and complicated version of photosynthesis. Don't get overwhelmed. All you need to remember is that the organelle where photosynthesis occurred is called a chloroplast. The chloroplast appears to us as green because they absorb all other wavelengths of light except for that one. The wavelength bounces off and we see it as the color green.
Photosynthesis has two phases, the light-dependent and light-independent reactions. The light-dependent reactions convert light energy into chemical energy, taking in photons and water and producing oxygen, as well as high-energy NADPH and ATP. These reactions take place in the thylakoid membrane and involve photoexcitation. In other words, a photon brings an electron to a higher energy state. The energy from this excited electron is harnessed via an electron transport chain, and the electron goes back to a lower energy state as it does a bunch of work for the plant. Meanwhile, the light-independent reactions, often referred to as the Calvin cycle, involve the input of the high-energy molecules produced in the first phase, as well as carbon dioxide and RUBP, to produce carbon-based molecules the plant can use, such as glucose, These reactions take place in the chloroplast stroma. Light-dependent reactions need light and take place during the day. Light-independent or dark reactions don't need light, so they could take place any time. Leaves are green because inside each plant cell there are many chloroplasts, each full of the green pigment chlorophyll. The parts of the chloroplast you need to remember to understand photosynthesis are the stroma and the granum, which is a stack of thylakoid discs. If you were to take a granum and look at a cross-section, you would find the site of the light-dependent reactions at the thylakoid membrane. The electron transport chain conducting these reactions is found here on the thylakoid membrane. Note the location of the stroma, as well as the lumen, in other words, the inside of the thylakoid disc. The complexes involved in these reactions are listed here. A mnemonic you can use to remember.
To put all of that more simply, inside the chloroplast are a couple processes that uses the energy from the sunlight to change the molecules of water and carbon dioxide into the sugar and oxygen. Energy is needed to break the molecules apart and put them back together. The sugars have potential energy inside of them. Remember that these sugars are stored in the bodies of primary producers until another organism eats them. We talked a little about changing sizes of the levels, but why does only 10% get passed on? Think about the life of a flower. They need their own energy to grow bigger just like you. They also need energy to do things like reproduce, to protect themselves and other things while they are alive. And guess what? When they die, not all the energy inside of them gets used up, so it decays into the earth. So, as a summary, we need autotrophs because without them we would not have anything to eat or any source to get energy. Primary producers are the base to the food triangle and essential to any food web.